our pledges always to do the contrary, not very fact or research-based. Just in the last session, you heard, and I don't mean to criticize anybody personally, but a couple of the questioners, one said that for 30 years we've made no progress in improving K through 12 education and getting a high quality with little success, I think were the words. Another questioner said that our K through 12 schools are broken. We're not going to make much progress if we assert these things over and over again with little basis in fact or reality. You all know, I'm sure, that the only reliable measure of American student achievement is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I'm sure you'll be surprised to know, because it said so little, I'm sure you'll be surprised to know that in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, American achievement has gone up phenomenally over the last generation, both for disadvantaged and for advantaged children, to the point that, for example, black children today at the elementary school level now perform at a higher level than white students did just 20 years ago. Let me repeat that. Black students in American schools today perform at a higher level than white students did only 20 years ago. That's a phenomenal rate of progress, and we give ourselves no credit for it, and we fail to mention it and build our policy on the basis of learning from this. If we did mention this more often, we might be looking at things we did right so we could do more of it, rather than only trying to find things that we've been doing wrong so we can do less of it. We're always hearing, for example, that Finland is the place to imitate. We should go to Finland and learn from Finnish education on how to improve. The reality is that the only international measure that's reliable, the PISA test, the Program on International Student Assessment, shows that for the last decade, the achievement of students in Finland has been plummeting, while the achievement of students in the United States has been rising. They're still higher than ours, but the gap is narrowing. Now, if you had to choose what kind of policy to imitate, a place that was low but rising rapidly, or a place that was high and falling rapidly, which would you choose to imitate? At least you ought to be able to make that choice, and you can't make it if we deny over and over again the progress that we've made. Now, having said that, the achievement gap, which is what we always focus on, has not narrowed very much. How can that be? The reason that the achievement gap hasn't narrowed very much is that white student achievement has also improved. That while black student achievement has been going up, white student achievement is going up as well, so the achievement gap narrows a little, even though all students have been making phenomenal progress. Now, social scientists have known for 50 years that the major cause of the achievement gap is not what's going on in school, but what's going on in homes and in communities and in families. Roughly, and this is an estimate from many studies, roughly 2/3 of the achievement gap is attributable to students' social, community, economic characteristics. 1/3 is attributable to differences in the quality of schools. That does not mean that schools don't make a difference. The first major American report to demonstrate the large share of the achievement gap attributable to family and community characteristics was the Coleman Report in 1966. And when that report was issued, many people wrung their hands and said, oh, this shows that schools don't make a difference, it's all family and community. And the great late social commentator, later Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, had what I think is the best description of how to interpret this kind of result. What he said is people are looking at the Coleman Report, the report that shows that the major part of the achievement gap is attributable to family and community characteristics. They're looking at this report and saying, oh, schools don't make a difference. Moynihan said that's absurd. Children don't make up algebra on their own. It's taken civilization 2,000 years to develop this. Whether children learn algebra is entirely a function of how good our schools are. Which children learn algebra better than others is a function of the families and communities from which they come to school. And if we think of it that way, I think it gives us an entry into how we ought to be able to be approaching the problems of the achievement gap and the problems of achievement that we want to improve in this country. Now, when you tell many people that it's the social and community characteristics, the economic characteristics of children that's the major determinant, on average, and I'm only talking about averages, obviously there are exceptions in every group, but it's the major determinant of the average differences between groups, they find that hard to understand. They say, well, what difference should a family's poverty make? Why can't a child whose parents don't have a lot of money learn as well as a child whose parents do have money? Why should the color of a child's skin affect how well a teacher teaches? And I think that it's necessary, because this is a common sense reaction and it's perfectly understandable, it's necessary to always explain to your constituencies and to the policymakers with whom you deal how it is that social and economic disadvantage translates into low student achievement. It's not simply how much money a child's parents have. Clearly that doesn't affect achievement. But it's the characteristics that children develop as a result of that social disadvantage that affects their achievement from the day they enter school and before. Secretary Duncan talked about early childhood. It's obviously critical. We know, and it's not simply a pre-K, it's not 4-year-olds. The achievement gap, to the extent you can call it achievement, the literacy gap, the cognitive gap exists by age 3. By age 3. And it doesn't change much by the time children then leave high school. Certainly they learn a lot, but children who don't have disadvantaged backgrounds also learn a lot. The achievement gap doesn't change much. There was a very important study done some 20 years ago in which 2 Kansas researchers placed tape recorders in the homes of birth to age 3 children of different social classes. And very briefly summarizing, what they found was that children whose parents were professionals, college educated, were hearing from birth to age 3 an average of about 2,000 words an hour. Children whose parents were working class, birth to age 3, were hearing about 1,300 words an hour. And children whose parents were on welfare, at that time the study was done, we had welfare, children whose parents were on welfare were hearing an average of 600 words an hour. And these Kansas researchers, and of course the quality of the language was different as well, the sophistication of the language was different. These researchers wrote a book called Meaningful Differences, and they showed that the gaps that exist by age 3 persevere throughout life, and in the best schools we can imagine. They don't disappear. Of course, children who only heard 600 words an hour on average are going to do better with good schools and good teachers than they would with poor schools and poor teachers. But are they going to do as well, even in the best schools, as children who heard on average 2,000 words an hour? I think it's an absurd expectation. And the only way, as a matter of policy, we can intervene in this is, as Secretaries Duncan and Sebelius said, is with high-quality early childhood programs. My problem with their presentation is not their advocacy of high-quality early childhood programs. I fully support that, and I think you should as well. What bothers me is the incoherence of their overall policy, because if we really believe that in order to narrow the achievement gap, we ought to provide high-quality early childhood education to every disadvantaged child, how can we at the same time have an accountability system which expects all children, whether or not they've benefited from high-quality early childhood programs, to have schools that bring them to proficiency at a very high level or to college and career-ready standards at a very high level by 2020? If we really believe that high-quality early childhood education is essential, and I do believe that, then we can't believe that children who don't have that are going to do as well as children who do by the year 2020, even if we did it today, even if we implemented it today. The children who benefited from that would just be in early elementary school by 2020. How can we possibly have a standard which says we're going to close the achievement gap by 2020 at a high level, college and career ready, without providing what we say is essential in order to do that, which is high quality early childhood? Now, there are many other characteristics of social disadvantage that translate directly into student achievement. Health differences are a big one. Children in low-income communities in this country suffer from much higher rates of asthma and lead poisoning, for example, than middle-class children do. Asthma and lead poisoning in particular has a concrete effect on IQ. Now, if you take two children who are equal in every respect, two groups of children who are equal in every respect, and both groups have high-quality K through 12 instruction, but one group has a higher rate of lead poisoning than the other, much higher rate of lead poisoning than the other, how can you possibly expect those two groups of children to achieve at the same average level with the best high-quality K through 12 instruction? Certainly, as I said, good instruction will get better achievement from children whose IQs was affected by the environments in which they lived. But it will not get the same achievement as it will from children whose IQs were not so affected. Children in low-income communities don't have access to the kind of routine and preventive health care that middle-class children have. The Affordable Care Act will provide insurance to children of all income levels or most income levels. It will not ensure that their communities are served by primary care physicians. Very few primary care physicians locate in low-income neighborhoods. This is something that incentives can be created, for which incentives can be created and you can do something about. But providing insurance to low-income families is not the same as providing access to high-quality primary and preventive care. And without that, we're not going to narrow the great differences in absenteeism rates, simply due to minor childhood illnesses between low-income and middle-class children. And again, without doing that, without providing high-quality primary and preventive care, not simply insurance, but by locating primary care physicians in low-income communities, without doing that, we're not going to be able to narrow the absenteeism rates. And if children aren't in school, they're not going to be able to benefit from how high quality the instruction we provide. Mobility is another way in which social and economic disadvantage affect achievement. There are many schools in this country, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, where mobility rates exceed 100%. For every seat in the school, 2 children occupy it in the course of a given year. How can you possibly expect good schools, no matter how good, how can you possibly expect good schools to narrow the achievement gap when children aren't present in the same schools day after day to benefit from that instruction? Teachers have to repeat lessons. Teachers have to constantly reconstitute their classes as some grow too large and some grow too small. This is a housing issue. It's not an educational issue. But unless we solve that housing issue, we're not going to address one of the major causes of the achievement gap. Now, all of these individual characteristics that produce low achievement are well known and have been well documented. But they are exacerbated. They are exacerbated enormously when we concentrate children with these kinds of disadvantages in the same schools. And this, indeed, is what we have been doing in this country. It is not just that individual children have impediments to learning because of the social and economic disadvantages with which they come to school, but they reinforce each other when we concentrate low-income, disadvantaged children, minority children, in the same schools. And in those schools, teachers have to teach to a lower average level of readiness with which children come to school. More resources are devoted to discipline and to instruction and to solving social problems than academic problems. Children themselves don't have higher achieving peers after whom they can model themselves and who can inspire a higher level of achievement. without deconcentrating poverty in this country, without deconcentrating disadvantage in this country, without dispersing disadvantage throughout the middle-class schools in this country so that children have a chance to benefit from high-quality instruction and highly motivated peers, there's going to be little chance of narrowing the achievement gap further. And in this regard, we have made virtually no progress. In fact, we're moving backwards in this country, and it holds out little hope of substantial further narrowing of the achievement gap. The share of black students who attend schools that are more than 90% minority grew from about 35% 20 years ago to 40% now. Let me say that again. The share of black students who attend schools that are more than 90% poverty has increased by 30%. That is from 35%, roughly 30%, to 40% today, just in the last 20 years. In 1990, black students typically attended schools in which 43% of their fellow students were low income. Now, the figure is closer to 60%. In 1970, the typical black student attended a school that was 32% white. Today, that's fallen to 30% white. That is, we are increasing the segregation of disadvantaged children, creating greater barriers to our efforts to narrow the achievement gap. Now, why is this? Well, we all know that schools are segregated, isolated racially, isolated by income, primarily because the neighborhoods in which the schools are located are segregated and isolated. Why are the schools in which they're located, why are these neighborhoods in which they're located so homogeneous racially and economically? The history of how this happened and what we need to do to change it has completely fallen out of public discussion in this country. Partly because it's easy to forget something that is unpleasant to remember, partly because the challenges of remedying it seem to be so overwhelming that it's easier not to even think about how to undo this. But let me say again, unless we do something to undo it, unless we deconcentrate the poverty and racial homogeneity of urban neighborhoods, we have little chance of making substantial progress in closing the achievement gap. Now, all of you, I'm sure, remember just about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I guess it's 6 years ago, the Supreme Court took up a case in which the school districts of Louisville and Seattle attempted to integrate their schools in a very token way by a choice plan that gave children an advantage in selecting schools if they would help to racially integrate those schools. It was a very small advantage they were given. It was only in a tiebreaker situation in case applicants were oversubscribed. But it was a token effort to attempt to accomplish some integration. And the Supreme Court found this to be impermissible. Justice Roberts said that there is no remedy, permissible remedy, for segregation that is residentially based and that is de facto. He called de facto segregation the segregation of neighborhoods that results from what he said any number of innocent private decisions, including voluntary housing choices. The reality is that this is utterly inaccurate factually. It's a myth. We do not have any de facto segregation in this country. We have forgotten the history, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we need to remember it, but de facto segregation is a myth that's been created by recent Supreme Court decisions. All of the segregation in this country, the residential segregation in this country, upon which our school segregation depends and which drives a good part of the achievement gap, has been created by federal, state, and local policy explicitly designed to racially separate the population of urban areas. Now, I know this is something that you will probably find difficult to understand, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time now just telling you some brief snippets of our history, all of which has been forgotten in order to help, I think, create the basis for a different kind of policy to undo it. In every one of the metropolitan areas of this country, residential segregation, what we call de facto segregation, was created by law. The first step, beginning in the 1930s, was to create a segregated public housing system, not in the South, not in border states, throughout the country. The New Deal began the first public housing programs in this country. Harold Ickes, a liberal in the Roosevelt administration, was responsible for administering the first public housing program in this country. And Ickes followed a policy of what he called the neighborhood composition rule. Public housing for blacks and for whites should be placed in neighborhoods in a way that did not disturb the residential composition, the racial composition of the neighborhoods in which they were placed. Now, the problem was that most urban neighborhoods were much more integrated today than they were back in the 1930s and 1940s. They were low income, but they were white and black low income mixed in together. So the neighborhood composition rule, in effect, further segregated the neighborhoods, because as more black public housing projects were placed in predominantly black neighborhoods and more white public housing projects were placed in more white, predominantly white neighborhoods, populations began to separate. And we got a much more separate urban area than we had previously. All right, so we had and there was a big housing shortage in that time, as you may know, in the 1930s, and especially during World War II and after World War II, when this policy continued. And I emphasize it was not a policy of the South, it was not a policy of the border states, it was a policy in New York and in San Francisco and in Chicago and in every major metropolitan area. As more and more public housing projects were built, both for whites in white neighborhoods and blacks in black neighborhoods, the populations separated. And then came World War II and the big push on the part of the federal and state governments and local governments to create suburban communities to finance construction, home construction, to solve the housing shortage in the country. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration and the FHA during the World War II period and after, and VA afterwards, financed most of the housing construction in this country in that period. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly, with the cooperation of state and local governments, required segregation in private suburban housing development throughout the country. In order to get an FHA mortgage from 1935 through about 1950, your deed had to promise never to resell the home to an African American. The mortgages weren't granted to whites. This was explicit federal policy. This was not implicit, nothing de facto about this. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration made mortgage guarantees only to white families and only if they promised never to resell to an African American. The major housing developments of this country, many of which have become folklore. Levittown in New York, in Long Island, the largest housing project, suburban housing project, private housing created in this country, was given advance federal financing. As Levitt did not have the financing to build 10,000 homes. He got it from the federal government, and the federal government required him to place a restrictive covenant in every home in Levittown, prohibiting sales to blacks or resales to blacks. The tiki-taki houses of Daly City in California had similar FHA financing, also for whites only, from which blacks were prohibited from moving. real estate agents who then sold these homes. And we all know that real estate agents practice widespread discrimination throughout, certainly until the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, and even today, just this week, the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued a new study, an audit study, in which they sent matched pairs of black and white testers to try to purchase homes in various communities, and found that discrimination still exists. White families are shown different homes than black families. Black families are shown fewer homes than white families. Real estate agents are all state licensed. It's the most heavily regulated private industry by the state governments in this country. Real estate agents have their licenses revoked for the trivialest of financial misconduct. Real estate agents have had licenses revoked for failing to maintain child support payments to their ex-wives. No real estate agent in this country that I'm aware of has ever had a license revoked for practicing racial discrimination. And yet it's the most common practice, and was the most common practice, of real estate agents throughout this country that helped to create and perpetuate racial segregation. This is not de facto. The extent of state regulation and supervision of the real estate industry, of real estate brokers, makes this unquestionably a form of state action that can be remedied and for which we are all responsible. You've heard a lot about redlining, how banks, in the period after all these suburbs were built, refused to grant loans to African Americans in white neighborhoods. This was not private action. The maps that the banks used, the redlining maps that designated which would be black and which would be white neighborhoods and who could be granted loans in each of them, were created by the federal government, by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a New Deal agency created in the 1930s that designed maps of every metropolitan area in this country and color-coded the maps by the race for which it was intended. Those were the maps that redlining was based on. This was not a private decision by bankers, on top of which banks, if anything, are among the most heavily regulated industries in this country. There are federal and state regulators crawling all over banks all the time, examining their loan portfolios. And all of these regulators were fully aware of the racial discrimination that banks were producing. This was a form of state action. Let me give you a couple of examples of this from different cities, just to give you a flavor of how pervasive our public policy has been in creating the racial segregation that we see today. I'll take a couple of examples from Louisville and Seattle, just to pick two cities that were the subject of the 2007 Supreme Court decision. In Louisville, the black ghetto and the white suburban noose that surrounds it was created specifically by public policy, by state and federal actors. In 1937, there was a flood in Louisville that made a large area west of downtown that was inhabited by white families uninhabitable, and white families left that area. That was in 1937. It was mostly vacant after the flood as whites abandoned the community. World War II came along, and large numbers of rural African Americans moved to Louisville to work in defense industries. The federal government built housing for those black workers, segregated black housing for the workers coming to the defense industry. And what neighborhood do you think they placed this housing in? The same neighborhood that had been abandoned by whites because it was considered uninhabitable due to floods. In 1960s, as late as the 1960s, urban renewal in Louisville dislocated large numbers of low-income families in the urban core of Louisville. Those families were all relocated to this same area, which now is, by the way, is the center of black residents in Louisville. It's the area that the Louisville integration plan was trying to give children an opportunity to move out of in order to attend more integrated middle-class schools. Federally, of course, as in the rest of the country, federally regulated banks didn't approve loans for African Americans in white communities. The FHA and the VA ensured that all homes in the suburban areas that were developing around Louisville had restrictive covenants. In 1954, an activist, a white activist, sold a home to a black family deliberately to try to integrate her neighborhood. Kentucky responded by putting the white seller on trial for sedition. And riots and mob violence eventually forced the family to leave the neighborhood. In general, throughout the country, when black families have attempted to move out of the ghetto into white neighborhoods, through the 1960s, they were met with mob violence, generally protected, that is, the mobs were protected by police. Arrests were rare, and a sure signal was sent to black families that moving into white neighborhoods was not something they should attempt. In Seattle, as elsewhere, the suburbs were developed in a way that was closed to blacks. William Boeing, whom you know is a Seattle leader because of his aircraft business, was also a major developer in Seattle. He developed several large suburban developments, not quite as large as Levittown or Daly City, but large suburban developments. Each of the developments he developed had plat plans filed with the county that pledged that no African Americans would be permitted to purchase homes in those suburbs. And this was true not only of Boeing's suburbs, but of other developers as well. The entire Seattle suburban area was developed on a whites-only basis by public policy. In 1948, the Seattle Real Estate Board, again, a state-regulated group, expelled a broker who tried to sell a home to a black family in one of these exclusive white neighborhoods. In 1957 in Seattle, a state law attempted to prohibit discrimination, racial discrimination, it was a good law, only in homes that were financed by the FHA, thinking that it was obvious that something that was government financed should not be able to discriminate. The state of Washington Supreme Court found that law to be unconstitutional, an unconstitutional abridgment of property rights, and the US Supreme Court refused to review it. When black baseball star Bill Russell moved to play basketball for a Seattle team in 1973, he moved to a white suburb. He was able to purchase a home, but every time he drove home, the police followed him and followed any black motorist driving to that neighborhood to ensure that this was not going to set a pattern for black residents. And very often we know of these kinds of incidents when other celebrities who have far greater resources than typical black families attempt to integrate a white neighborhood. Willie Mays, when the San Francisco Giants moved from New York to San Francisco in the late 1950s, Willie Mays was unable to find a home in a white community. The situation became so embarrassing that the mayor of San Francisco invited him to stay in his own home because he could not find private housing outside the black community. Eventually, Mays picked up and moved back to New York. Here in St. Louis, let me give you a couple of examples from here in St. Louis. I'm not picking on St. Louis, but since we're here, we might as well talk about it. Many of you may remember that the Pruitt-Igoe housing developments became a big symbol of dysfunctional public housing some 40 years ago. High-rise towers packed with welfare-dependent families, many single parents, gang activity. They were eventually blown up, dynamited in 1972. That's familiar to everyone. Few people know another side of St. Louis public housing history. When federal housing funds became available here in St. Louis during the New Deal, what St. Louis proposed to do was to raise a racially integrated low-income neighborhood, it was called a slum, where the population was about 3/4 white and 1/4 black, not unusual for urban areas in the country at that time, to build a whites-only, low-rise public housing project in this area that was presumably integrated. The federal government protested. The federal government had a separate but equal policy for public housing. The federal government told the city of St. Louis that it could not build a whites-only project in a black neighborhood, in an integrated neighborhood. It had to build a blacks-only project as well. And so St. Louis constructed a second public housing project at the other side of the city for African Americans. That took a situation in St. Louis which was integrated, though low income, and converted it into two segregated residential neighborhoods. Last year I had occasion to look into a New York story. Some of you may have read this. I, for years, being an education policy student, have been hearing Joel Klein, the former chancellor of New York, tell a story about how he knows that the only cause of the achievement gap is failing schools. And the reason he knows it is because he says, I grew up in public housing. I was a kid of the streets. And I owe my success to the fact that I went to a great public school. And so I decided to look into this some. It turns out it's true. Joel Klein did grow up in public housing in New York City. He grew up in a public housing project that was created for whites only in a white neighborhood for middle-class returning war veterans. His father was a war veteran in World War II. In order to get into this public housing project, this white public housing project that Joel Klein's family moved into, you had to have a two-parent family with a stable employment history. The New York City Public Housing Authority, for entrance into this project, it was in Queens, in the borough of Queens, New York, sent investigators to applicants' homes to make sure that they had well-behaved children and that they had adequate furniture to be able to move into this public housing project. It was not subsidized. The rent was not subsidized. The rent that Joel Klein's family paid to the New York City Housing Authority was actually higher than you would have had to pay if you purchased a home with an FHA mortgage not far away. But it was very desirable. That's what public housing was like in the late 40s and even 1955 when Joel Klein's family moved in. So the public housing project that he grew up in is not the kind of public housing project that we evoke when we think of public housing today. New York City Public Housing Authority also, of course, had blacks-only public housing projects. There was one just a few miles away from Joel Klein's, which was overwhelmingly African-American. That was subsidized. It was a lot of welfare families. The public housing system in New York City was designed to segregate the races according to the federal government's neighborhood composition rule. Then when the suburbs came to be built, Levittown being one example, the whites in the projects like Joel Klein's moved out to new suburban homes. That public housing project then was taken over by the subsidized program of the New York City Housing Authority and became another low-income, all-minority ghetto. All right, this is the history of how, and it's just a brief, few brief anecdotes I've been able to give you, of why we have segregated neighborhoods today on which our school segregation depends. And I want to emphasize again, we will not be successful in closing the achievement gap so long as low-income minority children attend schools in which children with disadvantages are concentrated. What can we do to undo this? Well, I think, if I'm not wrong, the history that I've been telling you is just dimly familiar to most of you and probably unknown to many. In order to create public support for the kinds of policies that I'm going to describe that are necessary to desegregate our metropolitan areas. And by the way, it is a constitutional obligation to desegregate these areas, because this is not de facto segregation, it's de jure segregation. It's segregation by law and public policy, even though those laws and public policies no longer exist on the books. In order to create the public opinion that will be necessary to adopt these policies, we need to re-educate the American people about this forgotten and suppressed history. Many other countries, as you know, have done a much better job than we have in re-examining their past and trying to acquaint themselves with the policies for which they're now ashamed, but which have had an enduring effect. I assure you that if you look in any textbook that you're using, that your states are using, in American history at any grade level, look at the curriculum of American history, both at elementary and high school, you will not find this history described. What you will find is a story, a historically inaccurate story, that restricts Jim Crow to the South and calls racial discrimination in the North private. It seems to me that the first step is to examine the curricula of our schools and bring this forgotten history back into it so that our young people can come to understand how we got to where we are and what we need to do to change it. Clearly, we need to take steps now, even with pervasive residential segregation, to attempt minor steps to integrate our schools. The Supreme Court will allow a few of them, magnet schools, for example, adjusting attendance boundaries, some school choice programs. These can do very little to solve the problem, although they're worth pursuing and should be pursued. They will do very little to solve the problem because in many of our largest metropolitan areas, the ghettos, the concentrated residential areas of poverty, are too far distant from the middle-class suburbs that we must integrate to make any kind of integration program based on current residential patterns practical. But we should begin. The major thing we need to begin to think about, and this is much longer term, although not all of it, than the kinds of policies we can implement today, is doing something about our residential segregation, and there is a great deal we can do about it. A couple of small policies that we should be thinking about. Some states, very few, have amended their fair housing policies. As the federal government, the Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination, with one exception. You can't discriminate against someone on the basis of their race. You can't discriminate against someone because of a disability, but you can discriminate against them because of the source of their income. The result is that in most states, Section 8 housing voucher holders are banned, as realtors and landlords are permitted to refuse to rent, typically in majority white or middle-class communities, to rent to applicants who have Section 8 vouchers, and these tend to be primarily minority and, of course, low income. That's what you have to be in order to have a Section 8 voucher. So the first and immediate step that should be taken is, I would urge you to consider whether your state permits discrimination on the basis of source of income, or whether you require landlords to accept tenants irrespective of the source of their income, that is, even if they do have Section 8 housing vouchers. Exclusionary zoning laws are another major area of state policy that should be addressed. Many exclusionary zoning laws were adopted for explicitly racial purposes. I didn't have time to document that in this talk, but the evidence is certainly there. Even if not adopted for explicitly racial purposes, they clearly have a discriminatory effect. Every suburb in this country should be obligated to take its fair share of moderate and low-income housing if we want the children of low-income families to have a fair shake at an integrated education. There's a good model. Montgomery County, Maryland, has the best inclusionary zoning law in the country. It requires every developer to set aside a certain proportion of units for low and moderate income families, and then the county goes a step further and purchases a share of those set-asides for its public housing program, so that low-income families are now dispersed throughout the county, and the research shows that they have dramatically better educational outcomes as a result. Clearly, real estate regulation is something that is a state responsibility, and we could do a much better job of ensuring that our real estate industry takes proactive efforts to combat racial segregation. There's much more of this. Let me give you my email address, and I'd be glad to send you documentation of any of the things I've talked about. It's riroth@epi.org. That's for the Economic Policy Institute.org. That's riroth@epi.org. I'd be glad to send you documentation of any of the things I've talked about. Some of this hidden history, not really hidden to scholars, but hidden to the general public about how our residential segregation came to be. And in the time remaining now, I'd be glad to take questions or comments, if any. And with these lights, I can't see anybody, so if you have a question, you're going to have to say something. Oh, thank you. No? Just introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Christina. I'm from the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, but I also live in Chicago. And I know that there's been a few studies done on the housing vouchers after they took down the projects in Chicago. And one of the things that came up was that young women and girls had much better success rates in moving to more integrated communities than young men. And they contributed a lot of that to change in just the community, and they were sort of singled out for being different, and some of the things that they traditionally did in their old communities were not so much accepted, even though they weren't illegal, like hanging out on the street corners and things like that, that they were targeted when they moved to their new communities. And I was wondering if you had any comments on that.
Well, it's funny you should ask that question. My very first job in 1964 was a research assistant for the Chicago Urban League. And I was working on that lawsuit that attacked the segregation of Chicago public housing projects, and it resulted in a settlement called the Gautreaux Settlement, which required the Chicago Housing Authority to distribute housing vouchers that could be used in the suburbs. And I'm not sure, it's probably too detailed to go into now, but I think that your question is putting together two different programs. That Gautreaux program has been remarkably successful. And the research shows that the children, both male and female, of Gautreaux families, as families who had these vouchers to move to the suburbs, had remarkably better outcomes, higher attendance, high school graduation rates, better adult outcomes, better achievement than children. There was a kind of a natural experiment than families who had Section 8 vouchers and did not move to white suburbs. The remarkable success of that program inspired the Department of Housing and Urban Development to mount its own experiment, which was called Moving to Opportunity. And it was Moving to Opportunity experiment that had the results that you described, I think, is what you're talking about, not the Gautreaux, not the Chicago-specific experiment. And one of the things that they found about the Moving to Opportunity experiment is that many of the families who were given vouchers moved to lower poverty census tracts, as they were required to do. but they were not typically suburban census tracts. They were census tracts that were very close to their old neighborhoods. And many of the children who were benefiting from these vouchers, even though they were now living in somewhat lower poverty census tracts, still attended the same schools they attended before. So the Moving to Opportunity program, which was not just based in Chicago, it was 5 cities, had much poorer outcomes than the Gautreaux program, which actually had families moving to white suburban communities, middle-class communities, with their vouchers. I think that what you'll find from that research is that the outcomes were positive both for males and for females from the Gautreaux program. And there's a new book just issued by Patrick Sharkey that studies the Gautreaux program and compares it to Moving Up to Opportunity. And I forget the title. It just was issued a couple of weeks ago. But it demonstrates the advantages of providing the opportunity for low-income, disadvantaged families to move to middle-class suburbs for their children.
Could you comment, please, on open enrollment and school choice and the effect nationally on concentrations? In my own community, it has taken integrated communities and actually created schools of poverty.
Yes. The question was about school choice. What the research shows is that choice increases segregation, it doesn't decrease it. It's often promoted as a way of giving children options to attend so-called better schools. Particularly charter schools are more segregated than regular public schools. The problem with choice as a solution is that, as I said earlier, most of our metropolitan areas are too large for children living in disadvantaged central city ghettos to actually be transported to truly middle-class suburban schools, for one thing. For second thing is most of the choice programs are intra-district, not inter-district. That is, they're only so that you can't use them. I did a study, and again, I'd be happy to send this to you, of Detroit, showing that it's completely impractical to attempt to integrate the school systems of Detroit and its surrounding suburbs through a choice program, even if it were permitted, because the distances are just too great. So the other thing, of course, that's the problem with choice is that it's inevitable that when you offer choice to a school, to parents in a school, the parents who are most likely to take advantage of it are those who are most sophisticated, those who are somewhat better off, although still not well off, than others. And so what you do is choice effectively creams off the most motivated students, leaving the least motivated and least supported students behind. Now, that's not a reason not to do it. I mean, I would not here suggest that the futures of the most motivated students should be sacrificed to the least motivated ones. I see no solution, as I said before, besides desegregating these neighborhoods. But choice is a very limited and, I think, problematic way to do it. People should attend their neighborhood schools, but their neighborhoods should be integrated neighborhoods. Low-income and minority children should be attend their neighborhood schools in middle-class neighborhoods.
Hi, my name is Maria Worthen with INACOL, the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. Thinking about the technology gap that exists in this country, where we have rural and low-income communities that have less access to adequate broadband for the technology that's needed for next-generation learning, I was wondering if you had any insights into the relationship between housing policy and that technology gap.
You'll forgive me, but no. I hate to be someone who talks about things they don't know anything about. Speakers are supposed to know about everything, but I really haven't thought much about that, so I apologize.
Hi, I'm Chris Losey with Pearson. And first, I just want to thank you and thank ECS for bringing forward a conversation that I think is really difficult and doesn't very often happen at the state level. You've really addressed some really thorny and pertinent issues around race and class, and kudos to you for having the bravery to do that. My question is about how this applies in rural areas. I totally agree with your diagnosis of the problem. I totally agree with your prescriptions. I spend a lot of time taking a look at the research on American Indian student achievement, and a lot of the remedies that are available in urban areas are simply not available in American Indian reservations. Any thoughts about how to address the concentration, isolation, depth, and duration of poverty experienced in those communities?
Well, as I hope I got across, there is no single solution. There's no single magic bullet that's going to do this. Many of the things that I started to talk about early on are going to improve achievement, even without being able to deconcentrate poverty. For example, the early childhood that the secretaries talked about, high-quality early childhood, will raise achievement of children who presently are behind by the time they're age 3. Providing good health care so that children can attend school, all of those kinds of things will raise achievement in rural areas. But obviously, if you've got an area that's geographically isolated, you can't add that additional element, which I said was so crucial, which is the area of residential integration. But that doesn't mean there aren't individual things that can be done, as we can do in urban areas. It's not that we cannot do things to address the social and economic disadvantages that children in isolated urban areas face, but they will be of limited value without adding that most important element of desegregating the neighborhoods. I see that the clock here is giving me maybe one more question. Well, maybe not. Thank you very, oh, is there one? Yeah, oh, okay.
Hi, Richard. John Myers from Colorado. Yeah, obviously, my question is, you and I have both worked on school finance formulas. How much or how little or what recommendations would you make to use school finance formulas to try to address some of the problems?
Well, clearly there are incentives that you could create through school and finance programs for schools that are more integrated, disincentives for schools that are not integrated. Much of this is not in the control of schools, but communities are the ones that they have schools, and communities that maintain exclusionary zoning ordinances, for example, could be financially penalized, or reverse schools and districts that adopt inclusionary zoning ordinances could be rewarded financially. Today, schools serving disadvantaged children have more per pupil money than schools serving typical middle-class children, even though they don't have as much money as the most affluent communities, primarily because of federal Title I. But the fact that they have more doesn't mean that they have enough. The funding formulas that we have give, even those that give weights to disadvantage, give weights to the much, much too small if we were serious about addressing these problems. Clearly, you all have serious fiscal challenges, but if there was one area that I think you ought to be looking at in your school funding formulas, it would be vastly increasing the weights that you give to disadvantaged children in assigning state aid to schools, and not deluding yourselves into thinking that a small increase in the weight for disadvantaged children is going to make much of a difference. The problems that these children face are enormous, and a 20% increment, for example, which is typical, is not going to do much to provide the kinds of backup services and social services that these children require. Thank you very, very much.
tremendous to have additional policies that we can talk about and discuss, and thank you for engaging with Richard, because the housing issue and some of the class and poverty issues that are facing our schools are at the root of what